Thank you so much for joining us this evening for Hacking the Syllabus, Critical Solidarities with Ananya Chatterjea and Thomas F. DeFrantz. So I understand we're operating within the frames of this virtual space, but within this, we want to make this feel as engaging as possible. So we encourage you to participate and welcome you to join in the conversation via the chat function. And if you're watching live from Facebook or YouTube, via the comments. And to get us warmed up, I'll start by asking, so we can do a type of virtual mapping here. Where are you all joining in from? And while we are meeting virtually, I would like to acknowledge that Asia Society New York is situated on the Lenape Island of Manhattan in Lenapehoking, the Lenape homeland. We pay respect to the Lenape peoples and also acknowledge that New York City has been a gathering spot and home for other indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. By acknowledging this, we hold ourselves accountable to a community to do the work of decolonization beyond simply land acknowledgements. So tonight's program is organized as part of the Asia Society Triennial, which comprises a series of programs and an exhibition entitled We Do Not Dream Alone. The exhibition features contemporary art from Asia and the Asian diaspora, and it opens next week, October 27th. Tonight's event also kicks off the three-part series, Hacking the Syllabus, Critical Solidarities, which shares both perspectives and resources on building intersectional solidarities. For part one, Ananya has shared a syllabus from a class that she's currently teaching, which is called Minneapolis Uprising 2020, Lessons from the Field and Practices for Solidarity Building via Artistic Practice. So this syllabus is currently up on Asia Society's website, and it will live there as a resource. And tonight she will give a lecture related to this syllabus, which will be followed by conversation with Thomas F. DeFrantz. So tonight's focus came about through some conversations I had with Ananya about her company. She told me that they had been rehearsing and dancing through these tumultuous times. And given that her company centers women of color, is driven by a philosophy of social justice, and possesses empathy or a type of softness to care for the human condition, we discussed how does one dance now, especially within the context of a pandemic and a heightened reckoning with systemic racism. How do we dance now? And how does the body and also the ensemble body situate within social movements? How do we dance with one another and build solidarities? These were just some of the questions that came up and we were percolating that inspired the focus for tonight. About our speakers this evening, Ananya Chatterjea is a choreographer, dancer, and thinker who brings together contemporary dance and social justice choreography. She is artistic director of Ananya Dance Theater, a Twin Cities-based dance company, and a professor at the University of Minnesota. And Thomas F. DeFrantz directs Slippage, a research group that explores emerging technology in live performance. He is a consultant for the Smithsonian Museum of African American Life and Culture and a professor in the Department of African American Studies and the dance program at Duke University. We are just incredibly excited to have these two really special artists and thinkers together tonight to kick off this three-part series. And if you think of friendship as a type of solidarity, that's also present tonight, as Ananya and Thomas are longtime friends and collaborators. We're honored to have them here and we're excited to dig in. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Ananya for her lecture.
Thank you, Sarah. Delighted to be here with Tommy. I live and work in Minnesota Makoche, the unceded homelands of the Dakota Oyate. And I begin by lifting up the principle that has been taught to me, mitakuye oyasin, We are all related. Hacking the syllabus. I begin with the reminder that knowledge is produced in different ways, at different sites, in relationality, and importantly, through embodied explorations. How we move, share space, recover from falls, respond to difficult moments through slow exhales, teaches us about our intellectual, emotional, and nervous patterns, and can prepare us vitally for the more just world that is struggling to be born. This spring and summer, as we in the Twin Cities were scrambling to work in compliance with the governor's shelter-in-place orders, George Floyd was murdered. I participated in the grief-laden protest and witnessed how it turned violent at the 3rd Precinct Police Station when tear gas and rubber pellets shot through the air, while a community responded from generational trauma, even as it was infiltrated by white supremacists from outside. The uprising followed. And then the crisis of affordable housing became even worse, and hundreds of unhoused peoples, forced out of the temporary shelters they had built, sought some respite by converging in encampments in the city's public parks. I had been creating a piece about home, borders, boundaries, loss, and belonging this spring. And when, after the necessary pause during the uprising, we found ourselves at the park near my house, there were many new learnings. I live about 10 blocks from the now burned down precinct and about 2 blocks from what was the sanctuary, an encampment of primarily Black, Indigenous, and Latinx women and femmes. We learned to navigate our solidarity with the unhoused community via mutual aid and organizing, and by inviting them to our training sessions if they were interested, but also trying to protect their privacy. As the encampment grew, we moved out from under the shade of the trees where we had begun rehearsing. And we found ourselves having to grow capacity for dancing for hours in the hot sun, dodging multiple flying balls from various group sports with whom we now shared the field, and dealing both with the slippery gravel of the baseball diamond, which blew up clouds of dust with every footwork, and the unyielding asphalt of the tennis court, which amplified the heat of the sun beating down on us. And in this practice of flexing to adapt to present circumstances, prioritizing the stories of the ground on which we danced, and of collectively reciting our bowls, syllabic and accompaniments over the sirens of police cars speeding by us, dancing deepened into a practice of listening, healing, and transformation more than ever before, and of building solidarity. Let me begin by sharing something we created out of that process. I request my relative Tommy to please share a quick video.
Thank In the name of your been-befores, we lift you from this bloodied earth. With the light of our hands and the breath of our hearts, we clear you. Starlight and spirit adorn you. The ancestors call your name. Go home now. You are whole, you are holy, you are powerful, you are loved. You are whole, you are holy, you are powerful, you are loved, you are safe. Go home now, go home now. You are whole, you are holy, you are powerful, you are loved, you are safe. Go home now. Rise, we say. Rise and become the wind that tears down these walls.
Thank you so much. So I was trained as a classical dancer. Yet the roots of my contemporary social justice choreography, located in transnational feminisms and activating a grid of Black and Brown solidarities, lie in my growing years in Kolkata. Troubled by the obscene vulgarities of gender, class, and caste violence that I witnessed inside concert dance, I rebelled against the beautiful but idealized classical dance world that managed the entry of marginalized voices. And the Kolkata of the 1970s and 80s, dominated by the political agendas of the left front government in the state, offered other opportunities to craft a deeply grounded yet expansive positionality. In my late teens, I began dancing with an ensemble of artists led by choreographer Shambhu Bhattacharya and songwriter Hemango Bishwas, who were committed to Bengali folk inspirations, class struggles, and resistance to political inequities. Together, they created pieces such as Shankhochil, which works through the metaphor of a seagull's song to critique the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and other repertoire calling for a determined moving forward of the legacy of the progressive movement. This dancing inspired my footwork and pushed me to understand rhythm as the drumbeat of a people's movement. And when I danced to Himangoda's singing of Namtar Chilo John Henry, a translation of Harry Belafonte's rendition of the Ballad of John Henry, I learned to engage local with global struggles in a powerful way, where the link was forged via working class struggles and a critique of imperialism. Such dancing, often performed in DIY conditions, usually for very little or no money, activated my political consciousness around class struggle and taught me the importance of weaving together deep local roots and transnational solidarities. Later on in graduate school, the powerful writings of Black and Indigenous feminists prepared me to align my body with different struggles without ever appropriating their voices. And I augmented what I was already learning through my artistic explorations. And I absolutely learned to choreograph by embracing social justice. I learned to create a mosaic of stories, to strategically highlight some moments over others, to balance revolutionary fervor and fiery rhythms with slow flowing femme intimacies, to remain engaged both with the divergences from and resonances with my own struggles, to listen for differences in timings and crossings of differently imagined spatialities which create tensions within our positionalities. I learned the value of ensemble choreography without simultaneity, of sharing footwork and formations while celebrating the difference of bodies and the divergent historic pathways through which we arrived on that stage. So one of the things we have learned over the last few years, and that the Uprising highlighted, is that no movement towards justice can be sustained when there are hidden flows of lateral harm. When we fail to understand systemic violence as interlocking and justice as multi-perspectived and intersectional assemblage. This, it turns out, is somewhat of a challenge in a super-capitalist society built on rungs of hierarchies that make for moments of visibility that are then amplified by social media megaphones and connected to resources. Because we are racialized in particular ways, Indigenous, Black, and Brown artists are often positioned along a pecking order in the hierarchy of preference and desirability among decision makers. And cast in competition against each other in this ladder of apparent meritocracy, we are systemically pushed to ignore the specific histories that locate us on uneven ground, even when we stand adjacent or close to each other. This promotes a kind of identity on steroids race, based on the non-viable assumption of the same starting line, and limits our capacity to revitalize solidarity through the power of our differences, even as we champion broad classifications of diversity. In contradistinction, I have learned from non-uniform ensemble choreography to show up together mindfully and differently. And this practice of holding my space and sharing light with colleagues, ensuring that we are all seen differently, stepping back at moments and forward in others, navigating stage lighting that invisibilizes some skin tones and overexposes others, teaches a practice of solidarity that goes way beyond simple codes of multicultural representation or diversity and inclusion. Part of the problem is that we are taught blinkered histories that obscure lineages of connectivity among our communities. The possibilities of meeting across different geographies and timeframes, historic, futuristic, generational, individual, for reasons other than the wars summoned by capitalism, are crucial in offering dimensionalities as we reach for cross-racial solidarities. I've been fascinated by pre-colonial Indian Ocean sea routes, which connected traders and others from across Asia and Africa, and created shared practices such as indigo dyeing. And in 2018, I made a piece exploring these forgotten histories, Shatranga. The research taught me about many different kinds of transnational meetings, mostly undocumented, histories that we now have to conjure from the waterways of story, myth, and imagination. Of course, there are other confluences closer to current times. Vivek Bald's Bengali Harlem, recording the lives of Bengali Muslim small merchants settling in Harlem and creating families with Black and Puerto Rican Americans. Goitra Bahadur's Coolie Woman, tracing the history of indentureship and the meeting of African and South Asian communities in the Caribbean. Nico Slate's Colored Cosmopolitanism, recording the complex relationships between the African American civil rights movement and the Indian anti-colonial movement, are important examples. And thanks to the teachings of powerful Dalit leaders, we know that though race and caste are different, Black Lives Matter is shining important light on the parallel movement for Dalit Lives Matter. And we are being called to recognize how the workings of supremacist governments, racism, and casteism lodge themselves in our brains. So what is the work we have to do to refuse co-optation by capitalism's mandate of competitive individualisms? Resist the proliferation of global systems of hate, and keep alive lineages and traces of relationships that have existed among us, even as we forge new alliances. How can we make self-reflexivity an instinctive practice so we are always vigilant about our implication in systemic privilege? And we are always connected to Dr. Cornel West's articulation of radical love, seeing the world from the lens of the most marginalized. The Uprising has taught me to value even more deeply a practice of dancing that can prepare our somatic beings for sharing vibration and light. Conjure connection and spirit. Find a commons of justice and affirmation, and come to know embodied difference. Going in a minute from fast rhythmic footwork, sweeping arm gestures, to slow, extended flow sequences has reinforced the learning necessary to move nimbly from pushing back against state and systemic violences to listening carefully within communities we call our own, but those communities experiencing layers of harm, so that we can break the chain of violence begetting violence begetting violence, and learn to regulate our breathing so we are able to integrate our nervous systems inside community contexts that can offer oxygen instead of responding from perpetually heightened states of alert or dissociation. How to learn to be with each other differently and play the long game. This is something I have practiced for years with my comrade and friend, Professor Thomas DeFrantz. To move us forward, I refer to his formulation of the transmigrations of energetic inflections and formations as a mode of what he calls switch. DeFrantz talks about social dances originating in queer communities of color, flowing into mainstream popular culture, and sometimes moving further onto high-level political stages. In the process, their originally queer articulation and racial particularity may be covered over by heteronormative, white, powerful embodiments. Yet, DeFrantz argues that gestural hauntings remain, nudging open spaces for difference. Quote, these hauntings demand our embodied attention, even as they dissipate through gesture. In that moment, we switch and the light comes on, fugitive or not, and queers of color make space for physical dissidence and creative expression, end quote. The key trope in DeFrantz's discursive structure, the switch, is the ability of morphing in survival, which assigns agency to marginalized communities and to the transformative possibility of retentions through migrations. DeFrantz reminds us, quote, the switch is powerful. The change it heralds underscores versatility and capacity, end quote. I deploy DeFrantz's theorizing of the switch here as a mode of building solidarity through dancing. In a new abstract solo, paying tribute to incarcerated BIPOC women and femmes, I prepare my body to be a portal. I visit Sandra Bland, Safura Zargar, Raynette Turner, Gauri Lankesh, Breonna Taylor, Manisha Valmiki, and many others. Every time I dance it, I am haunted by the gritty resilience and creative interventions of marginalized queer, BIPOC, Dalit, Muslim women and femmes. In such moments, dancing becomes a practice where we make palpable, resist, witness, and register in cellular memory unspeakable traumas that our sisters, our relatives have endured. Every time I am left shaken. The switch is a powerful tool in social justice choreography. It conjures other presences, is a strategy of momentary becoming, distinct from simple representation and from appropriating voice. The switch is a mode of quivering alongside other life forces, coming to know difference from embodied experience, of arriving at cross-racial, cross-caste, cross-gender solidarities through breathing alongside humans whose suffering and pain are often spectacularized, even as they are denied subjectivity. To inspire the collective work of solidarity that we must embark on, I invoke two brilliant poets. First, South Asia's beloved Faiz Ahmed Faiz, who reminds us, Bol ke lafz azad hai tere, bol zaban ab tak teri hai. Speak, for your lips are free. Speak, for your tongue is still yours. And lastly, the brilliant poet June Jordan, who reminds us, speaking about and to the 40,000 South African women and children protesting the Dompas laws, we are the ones we have been waiting for. Thank you. I invite my friend and comrade, Thomas DeFrantz, to join me.
Well, first there's gratitude. And before I speak, I need to offer a grounding gesture from where I'm broadcasting in the unceded lands of the Shakori, the Ino, and the Catawba people. I want to bring into our conversation, Ananya, a relative of mine that I've been thinking about since we agreed to have this conversation in public. I've been thinking about a great-grandmother whose name is Kotala. She shows up in my ancestry sorts of diagrams as a mulatto woman, someone who has no history, but before the moment of a census from the 19th century, when she is materialized to me through these documents as a native African-American person who kind of embodies in a way this call that you're making for us toward a realization of our connectedness. So I hope that Kotala will allow me to speak and give us the permission to continue, since we ask our elders before we begin. So there's gratitude and there's love. There's this call towards radical love that you make towards us, and also the sharing of this expert, mature vision of choreography and dance as possibility. There's so much juicy in the lecture that you offered to us, and I have several things I'd like us to see if we can tussle with together to see where they take us. Let's begin with the idea of locality and the local and how it's so urgent today. We know that we're gathered, especially through these platforms like Zoom, because of COVID and the Rona, and how we're figuring out what it is to be able to gather in this particular moment. But there's also this call towards a new kind of confirmation of the importance of the local. What is it to be among the people who are here in this place where we are, and trying to understand how this place has imagined itself and materialized as itself. Let's chat a bit about locality and how it's urgent, especially to you as an artist and someone who is incredibly involved in all sorts of social justice possibilities and renderings that allow us to imagine forward. How does the local operate for you?
Thank you, Tommy, for that beautiful question. Local, I think about locality as I think about my sari. This idea of hand-woven or hand-loom sari. This is from the Rangamati area of Bangladesh. It's a Bengali sari. It's a Bengali sari, but it is not from the Indian side of Bengal where I'm from, but from my relatives over in Bangladesh. I point to it because I feel like the weaving, the labor of weaving is on my body. The labor of locality is on my body. And I thought a lot about how I love Faiz Ahmed Faiz, poet of Pakistan. And how how language is dear to me, how I identify with so much love, my identity as a Bengali person.
Yes.
And I speak, I am irritated with the way in which Hindi is pushed on us as dominant language. So I don't like, if people talk to me in Hindi, I tend to be not respond. It's difficult. It's a whole complex situation, but at the same time, I'm stand in admiration of the brilliant Urdu poetry that Faiz Ahmed Faiz wrote, right? So I think this notion of locality deeply grounded within, when we are deeply grounded inside of that, I think it allows us actually to, the wideness of the roots actually allow us to have wider branches. And I feel that having connected and worked in solidarity with my Dakota and Anishinaabe sisters and relatives here in Minnesota really pushed me to reimagine the work we were said to premiere this fall. Yes. In different locations of Minnesota, this beautiful state where it snows in mid-October. It is still beautiful. And it got me to appreciate, the Coldwater Springs, the Mississippi River, so much beauty right here. So I feel like that locality is both something we are gifted with perhaps at birth, and also that we develop through relationality.
That makes a lot of sense to me, even as we're working in the areas of contemporary expression that might want to tour. And you yourself as an artist, as we're thinking of our container, the Asia Society even, and you were talking about these transmissions and global flows, but thinking about them in more complex ways where they are global, yes, and they're also quite particular to where people live who aren't doing the traveling necessarily. But you're helping us maybe think about how the ideas and the sensibilities and the textiles, if you will, the labor, are in motion and are traveling from place to place, so that we have many ways that we travel. It's not only about being an artist who's appearing here and there and there and there. Yes?
Yes, and also beauty, right? I think this is one of the most things, perhaps the thing that I'm most stubborn about, what we find beautiful, right? Especially in dance. What are the aesthetics? Because somehow aesthetics, especially embodied aesthetics, sometimes we tend to absorb things that we find beautiful, but then we start to see an erosion of difference. And that's difficult. I've talked a lot about what I call the tyranny of the pointed foot.
Sure.
How without conversation, suddenly I'm seeing people in South Asian dance forms point their feet when actually there is not iconographic or any kind of evidence for that practice having existed ever.
Well, you pointed, yes, it's fantastic, because you also pointed us towards thinking about, I can't remember the exact phrase you used, but the marginalized, the people who are pushed to the outside. But if we move to those places, that requires a certain kind of vigilance and persistence. It's much easier to just kind of go along with the crowd. And when the crowd produces buildings that are monuments to the pointed foot, if you will, or whatnot, it can be more of an actual commitment to possibility, to keep expanding contexts and contents for notions like beauty. I think that's something you were helping us think through, yes?
Yes, and this notion of nimbleness requires groundedness.
Nice. Mm-hmm.
So, I do think that that's also how the notion of travel is important of travel is important in order that we might see our connection. The notion of and there is another kind of travel that we can't mix it up for. And that's how imperialism works, right? Through silently entering our living rooms when we didn't really ask it.
This kind of turns towards a second larger point that I wonder if we can tussle with. You had this phrase, alignment without appropriation, and it landed with great value and great rhetorical force. This question of appropriation is a question that we are constantly faced with. This semester, I'm teaching a course at Duke University on Black dance, and the question of Black dance without Black bodies, BIPOC people being sort of called or at least indicated, but not necessarily present in a conversation of lands that have been ceded or unceded, always unceded, it seems. So it takes us to this question of appropriation without alignment, without appropriation. Let's start with how you do that in your own creative practice and your own sort of way of life. How do you manage that?
So let's talk about maybe this solo that I'm dancing right now. I was called to it because I was making this work about, borders and violences. And I was in this residency at Mansi, and we were collaborating with some of the organizers and folks who work in the Southern Poverty Law Center and others. And they, it was people who said, I see the stories I work with every day, but you cannot have a piece without talking about solitary confinement. And I was like, okay, all right. So, first, so it's the opening comes from research, right? But then how do I take that on when I have not experienced solitary confinement? So I'm thrown back to the moment when many years ago, actually, I created this piece, and there was anyway, in New York called Unable to Remember Rup Kanwar. Rup Kanwar was a young woman who was burnt to her death on her husband's funeral pyre in a terrible.
I remember the story.
You remember that. It was devastating. At any rate, I feel like, the only woman who knows what Rup Kanwar went through is a dead woman. So partly, how do we invite in, first of all, how do we say, how can we remember Ruk Kanwar without telling her story in a linear narrative, which is not, I'm not trying to do that. In a similar way, I feel like what I'm trying to do, though, here, this idea of more that I've worked with healers, the more clear I am that about portalizing practice. And I think that I feel like performers, Tommy, we have let ourselves get pulled away from theorizing energy as a material existence, the existence, material energy of existence, and we've allowed it to be, new ageized, I suppose. But it's real. We know this, that energy is that which is at the drop of your stomach and which pulls you up at that moment. And I feel like what I experience every time I dance this piece is that I am shaking so much from inside because, in fact, I have allowed myself to be portalized. And so in that moment, and I really do see the sense, and this is not, I'm not talking something new agey, like, but it's otherwise known as spirit. It is otherwise known as, I suppose spirit. That's what it is. So I feel like if you're not trying to tell a story, or you are never, if you are never trying to tell a linear story, or ever trying to save people, I think when you recognize the cellular expansion of your body, to spirit, I think you invite others to come sit with you.
That makes a lot of sense, to think of spirit, as foundational in so many African-derived, if you will, or of the continent, let's just say African with a K, African, excuse me, sort of practices of performance, excuse me. Thank you. And community. So this idea of spirit and alchemy, and also this notion that dance is a technology. We're understanding this better and better and better, that this doesn't try to force us into some sort of science paradigm that we might be uncomfortable with as we're accessing our understanding of ancestors. But it also doesn't sort of deny the possibility as a way to survive, be nimble, and reorient, realign, to respond to conditions. Dance as a technology, that's what it does. It allows us to respond to conditions with a different approach that might allow us to gather in this commons where we don't have to be in competition, hopefully.
Yes.
But let's turn back to this idea of appropriation just a little bit. So you described it in terms of not wanting to play at a circumstance that someone else, had endured that you hadn't, of course. But how does this operate for you in terms of the diversity of the artists that you collaborate with? It kind of tilts towards another large theme, which is the power of our differences. And that was another concept that landed with huge rhetorical force in your lecture just a moment ago. But as you're turning towards the differences and trying to think outside of a capitalist framework where appropriation would be, oh, that's a great idea, let's put it in our piece. But you're after something else. How do you do it? And how do you think of this coming nearer to each other?
So footwork, right? Footwork, my beloved practice of footwork. I love it because it allows me to think about time that is somewhat elasticizable, right? Small subdivisions of the same time frame, large marked steps of one. I love footwork, and it connects me to ground and vibration in a vital way. So sometimes when all of us are doing the same footwork, it's one thing. It can be one mode of practicing listening to each other and catching each other's time. However, there are other times when, when I'm practicing one particular interpretation of that same, let's say, 7-count phrase, 7 being my favorite number, and someone else is filling that in with making that a 14 or marking the opposite, emphasizing the opposite moments.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for me, that's about how we can hold on. I have to still hold on to my interpretation of the 7 while making sure, while I listen to and enjoy the spaces in between in which we can sit with each other. I'm reminded of an experience with my beloved friend, Lori Carlos,
Yes.
in the kitchen, where we would talk. It was amazing where this idea of talking, people from the outside sometimes thought we were talking over each other. Actually, we knew exactly where the words fell in between. And to know each other that well, to have that chemistry of really intertwining with each other while staying really strong in our own positioning, is something I value so deeply.
It's tilted towards this idea of the power of difference. And this, this is maybe a much more progressive or a progressive kind of way to imagine the resurgence of diversity as a vector. And, we want to be very suspicious of that. It's looking a lot like multiculturalism, which you also referenced in your lecture, as a kind of, it's icky. It's just not cool at all. But there is something about biodiversity, diversity, the power of our differences that is urgent in terms of building something that can resist and also imagine forward. How does this, so the power of the difference in your example of you and Lori Carlos, she's still here with us, of course, but you're the ways that you work together but also don't fit. How do you make space for the places where it doesn't work? How do you make that space?
So that's about choreography, right? So some things will not fit. And, many years ago, I think I remember Beverly saying, well, I have arthritis in my left toe and my left toe does not bend like that. Okay. So the entire company had to change the step to put it on the right foot so Beverly could do it, right? And I think that, I recognize that our bodies are different. So this idea, that's why this ensemble but not sameness is supremely important. So we can change it, so I'm not going to stand on my left foot for 2 hours. I'll fall down. So, but some of the amazing artists that I work with can stand on right leg, left, for hours. So for me, I'll choreograph something that is more successful, but fitting in within that idea. So this idea of being able to share a platform without being the same is crucial. And I feel like for me, that's choreography,
It speaks, it's fantastic because again, it speaks to the Asia Society as a container. They're the host for our conversation tonight, but the idea of Asia as being a kind of coherent possibility, especially in this capitalist, neo-colonial, well, very colonial West where we work and live, and the space of the United States, the so-called United States, if you will. But this possibility of a shared movement seems urgent, and that allows for difference. And then, as you offered in your story, makes space for disability to be part of, if you will, a part of how we move forward. We make space for each other and imagine a kind of like spilling out. You also talked about this as resisting hate. The capitalism lodged in our brains, and then, we have to move towards our abilities to resist this hate that capitalism kind of keeps putting in front of us. What does that mean in terms of being an artist who works with people? I mean, how do you make space for their labor? And I don't want to talk about resources as though they're finite or there's some sort of, crisis around having enough money. But I do want to talk about abundance and sharing possibilities among the artists you work with. How do you do that as a lead artist on many projects? How are you able to compensate and sort of help your collaborating artists towards their own needs and possibilities?
So, if we think of dance as not this thing that, okay, so okay, let me take that back. If you have to think about, I do think of dance as the work they do, right?
Yeah.
So the company has worked really hard to put people on payroll. So that means that, and there was a lot of work that was done to make that, and a lot of, talking to people and writing grants, as you know. At the same time, I don't think we can approach this kind of work as just work, right? So someone will ask me, people ask, especially in these, since the uprising, people will ask, can you do this piece, for instance, can you dance something as this direct action moment on the street? Of course I will, right? I mean, there's no question about money. You're on the street, you're in the middle of a crowd in coronavirus, and you're doing your best to be careful, but how are you going to not show up, right? So partly that balance is a really complicated navigation, Tommy. And I think that sometimes we tilt towards one and sometimes towards the other. I think that that practice, yeah, and I think the solidity
Yes.
with which you can practice, you can show up for your practice, whether it's on the street, during a march, at a rally point, and on the stage, or when it's being filmed. That's where I begin to understand the notion of artistry, and I hope I'm sharing that with the artists that I'm working with as I build next generation platforms. I'm interested in platforms. I'm not interested in a company for myself. I'm interested in leaving behind for the next generation artists that I'm mentoring right now a platform so they don't have to go and restart the whole thing all over again.
That's terrific, and it also tilts towards the final sort of large point that I wanted to bring back for us to tussle it together. I have so much gratitude for the way that you're reading that essay Switch and this concept. Thank you for doing that work and allowing those ideas to resonate really differently in a super important way. This idea of morphing towards survival. I mean, it's something we're all very much embedded with now, and it is this work that you might make for a stage or for a studio or a gallery or for an outdoor space now is maybe in a street, it's in a protest, it's on a platform, it's in different sorts of locations. And then you told us how you were working in the encampment and underneath maybe first, and then the circle keeps growing. So this idea of morphing towards survival, and I think what you called gritty resiliencies, and that concept of gritty resiliencies just seems so incredibly urgent for BIPOC folks and especially BIPOC artists, that we're so often engaged in gritty resiliency because, yes, what choice do we have? And also, why wouldn't we be? Why wouldn't we be morphing towards survival and as you say, fertilizing out towards a future that we don't know what it is, but we definitely are here to make possible somehow. So gritty resiliency, that phrase, can you just help us rethink it a little bit and reorient towards it?
Yeah. So I think I thought a lot about this summer's practices, right, in the field in Bracken Park. Shoes, typically anathema, right? But also very difficult to find footwear.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, deeper training in pelvic floor engagement so you can actually lift your feet. But also constant interruption by police cars, and sirens, getting trying to find our bowls as we are, ta, ah, ah, ti, we are holding, even as we are desperately trying to breathe behind our masks, and the super hot sun and watching out. For me, the grittiness of it is in being able to hold my chalk on one leg in the middle of that, because I'm falling off, and that's okay. At that moment, I fell off, but I did my best not to have a knee-jerk reaction where I judged myself and I judged everything. But I recognized, I didn't let it go either and be like, oh yeah, it was okay. I fell because there were so many things going around, and I have to call, and I flagged that moment as teaching me, what can I do next time? Because when I fall, I'm also holding on my shoulders. I'm carrying not just myself, I'm carrying many people. So what does that mean? I just have to understand. The grittiness of it is understanding the weight of each of those moments for me. And it's not smooth, right? It's like, okay, so then, so what? So then, like, there's many questions that arise, and it's kind of roughly sewn together, if you will. So I have to just think through all of that, and they will all be present at the same time, but I won't manage to get to a neat resolution.
Right. It's not that you want to smooth them into some sort of singularity, which we're not looking for that. And that's been super clear. There's also a way that, as you told the story, you grounded us in how you came to understand not just your calling, but the purpose of dance in your life and the life of people who've gathered near you. And now that continues to sort of fertilize and spread through encounters like this and your many sorts of performances. But there's a way that dance education, to be open towards social justice as a primary vector or value, not an add-on. So right now we're seeing lots of add-ons all over the world. Let's add the social justice component to our curriculum that's mostly modern dance, in a very Western sense. And this question, it's adapted from something that's come from one of our participants in this call. So, hacking the syllabus towards its obvious, sort of emergence from social justice possibility, because again, dance as a technology answers a question of social justice that's needed. But you've just been doing this in a really kind of particular way. So can we tilt back towards hacking the syllabus and chat a bit about how you imagine that working, and how do we help people understand that this has been a quality that's always present in dance, but as you say, gets obscured and covered over?
Yeah, I think it's because I have been moving dance towards the possibility of what healing dimensions can dance have. If I ask that question, then I'm going to think about, I'm going to still think about nervous systems in a very embodied way. So I will still be thinking about how I can work with line, right? But it's not going to be about that kind of displayed possibility, but it's going to always be about finding to move away both from the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems constantly, right? So what does that? Rhythm does that. And what does that in a way that students don't feel that it's not about perfection, but finding their own alignment, vibration, right? So I feel like it's really about redefining dance period. I think if for so long I feel like we've told students, well, that's how it is in the outside world, so you've got to get it together and do that. Yeah. Well, guess what? The outside world is over in some ways. We are redoing things in very different ways. That doesn't mean we won't have performances again or we won't have touring again. We probably will, who knows? But the point is, how can dance both be that possible dance be that vector towards healing? And how can we say, today I practiced it. It was an practice. This is a practice that never gets consolidated, that refuses capitalism's biggest promise, that it will consolidate into something you can buy and sell. It's every time you do it, that difference, that notion of difference that is embedded in dance is its brilliantest thing, brilliantest value. And I hope we can keep emphasizing that for students so they keep dancing as much as they can every day and appreciate its difference every day.
Now, that's fantastic. And this idea of refusing the consolidation that capitalism continually calls for. And we see this in the competition worlds, if you will. Now we're moving quite far from the work that you've been up to, that we're all, called to reimagine dance in terms of its healing capacities. So that even, and we know this from older, mature dancers who keep engaging in their practices because literally it's a sort of healing technology. And how can we sort of place that at the center of the syllabus that's trying to say, here's what you need to know, here's how you need to just understand these rhythms, but actually, how do the rhythms project and predict and fertilize a collective possibility? So really trying to maybe rewind us or reorient us towards these capacities, which have never left. And I would say they're there even in, the Vogue competition or the house dance competition that so many of our Korean sort of sisters and brothers are in, if you will. There's a healing capacity, but again, it's obscured somehow. So, you're reminding us maybe to open that door again or that window towards healing dimensions as a place to work from. Yes?
And to always emphasize the epistemology over the ontology. So it's not what we do, but how we do. So dance offers visibility, but it's not visibility for spectacularization. It's not that kind of visibility, but it's a visibility that allows us to actually carry more, invite more with us. It's a visibility that then invites platforms towards justice, right? So it's always the how. I want to emphasize that. And it's in the same way. Like I think social justice choreography is not the same thing as political dance, right? Political dance. But I think people mistake that, I can make a political dance in my, in a very private, isolated corner outside of COVID, right? Corner and, really perform it for, $100 tickets, which I might say that are important, but it might not reach the people that we want and who need it. So then what is, and you might be creating, costumes with fabrics that are produced in very difficult conditions. So whose blood is on our hands is the question we always have to ask.
And in that formation you just offered, I thought, who's being healed? And often in the way I imagine what you just said about a political dance in a corner, if you will, the artist is healing maybe themselves, but social justice sort of possibilities demand that we imagine ourselves alongside, within, not a single beings, consent to not be a single being. Right. Well, the question that also has come up is, how do you do the work that you do without sort of making it a clap back? So how do you do your work to center yourself? I kind of know what you'll say to this one, but how do you center your own sort of activities without having to constantly describe them as being an alterity to a certain kind of Western sort of productivity or Western model of dance making? And I actually know that you've had quite a journey in this through your career and your wanderings and makings, if you will. Does this question make sense?
Yeah, I think that, it's interesting because, I was never centered in Western practices anyways. So it's only when people say back to me that, oh, that I recognize my alterity through other people's reflections. I only know my work, and I only I do understand my difference and alterity from inside classical practice, classical salvation.
Yes.
Um, and there are sometimes violences inside of certain kinds of exclusions. And I suppose one has to work with, there is pain in that. There is pain in that, in that being, in that push away, because I think there are no, things are not black and white inside that kind of frame, right? I still think Odissi is a beautiful dance form. I love it. um, I find its formations difficult. I take the chalk as my ground. I tilt my chalk towards justice. But those people who appoint themselves the guardians of the chalk, self-appoint themselves, reject my work. That's just what it's got to be. But I wasn't dancing for them in the first place, I suppose.
You're there now because the work is abundant and it continues to grow and expand as it needs to. But let's tussle with it for a moment more. We have a few more minutes. How did you get there, though? Because so some of the younger artists and thinkers and makers and folks on this call are curious. How do you get there? When people keep saying you're doing it wrong or I reject your work, what are your strategies to be able to validate your own sort of values and your own sort of orientation towards dance, healing, and social justice? How did you get to the place where you are, and what strategies do you recommend?
So this is why the practice is so important, right? One of the things I work with, I work in this hacking the syllabus class, that the moving in in alignment with the Uprising class that I'm teaching right now, is I teach about the warrior practice. The interesting thing about the warrior, even as I make sure that everyone understands that yoga is being appropriated both, on the one side by the big capitalist industry and on the other side by Hindu fundamentalists. I recognize both kinds of stealings that are happening, but the practice itself has something to offer, right? So it's like they're pulling something out from a narrow place. What the warrior practice reminds us is that the one leg is in parallel, strong parallel, and the other, if it is warrior one or warrior two, is in a turned in or turned out position, and your sits bones are even. Your tailbone and your sits bones are even. That means that you have to constantly negotiate one hip moving back and other hip moving forward. It means that you have to really understand that supporting yourselves comes from acknowledging the alterity inside your body. Infrastructural difference supporting solidity of positioning. But I want to just offer that as a note. I think that thinking through practice is actually important, but also I'm a feminist. I'm a transnational feminist. Yes. And I am absolutely supported and buoyed up by the work of amazing thinkers and artists. I had an amazing mentor in Dr. Brenda Dixon Gottschalk. I had a friend like you. We met in grad school. We've carried each other through. So I want to say that this is why I began by saying knowledge is also produced in relationality. It is relationships that sustain us and hold us through time, because this world, especially the arts world, is so cruel. It's so cruel in the way in which people will talk to you about how you are not the desired person at the end of their funding circle, right? It can be offered in a different way, but I think people don't. People simply, talk in difficult ways. Presenters do that. So it's something to recognize how to build that muscle fiber of like, all right. And I want to hold up Jaole Zolar for a minute. I was researching, as you know, my first book was about her work, and I was researching in her office, and I saw a review that shocked me. I was like, oh my goodness, this person didn't get it at all either. So, and I asked, how did you deal with these? And she was so calm. She said, I guess this person just didn't get it. And it didn't even phase her. So it was an important lesson to me, who gets to have real estate inside my head. And so let me turn it back to this syllabus. I think, like you, sometimes this course I'm teaching has, and several of my students are non-BIPOC.
Mhm.
And I think either the forces of hate are going to invite them, or they're going to get pulled over to be on the front lines of the revolution in solidarity with us. I choose to do that work of bringing them over and inviting them.
Oh my, yes. Well, thank you, Professor Chatterjee, Ananya, my sister. You ended with the poem, the great line, "We are the ones we've been waiting for." And there's something in that rhetoric that is, that idea, that concept, that feeling, which is about when we recognize the broad diversity, if you will, inside of us. Like, we're already there with these competing ideas, but we're moving towards abundance, moving towards beauty, moving towards radical love, moving towards the just kind of remarkable film that you and your artists, your collaborators have made in the last 2 weeks. How recent is that film? When did you make that film?
Oh, this summer. And
Oh
it's
my gosh, yeah.
parts, yeah.
Yeah, and that this creativity, the drive for a Creative Commons, towards a possibility of enlarging the circle to those who don't have homes, to those who are being pushed out of our so-called borders, who are literally being murdered in the streets and hated on. Like, part of our responsibility as artists of the dance might be to turn towards care and to realize that we are the ones we've been waiting for.
Yes, I want to thank you for that, because I so often in these last few months, I have just absolutely come to realize that unless we put care work at the center of revolution, we will fail again. That's why the practice of being with each other differently, so crucial.
And here we are. We have to be different than we were 8 months ago. We have all kinds of realizations that are happening. And we thank you so much, Ananya, for sharing your ideas, your artistry, and your commitment to beauty and feminism and possibility.